All right, here we go. We'll see how this works. All right, section 3 here is the Vietnam years at home. So, we're going to be talking about our objective here is evaluate the impact of the Vietnam era on American society. Uh, Now, there's a lot that's going on. There's a lot of protesting. There's a lot of people. The country is divided. It's coming together on certain things. It's a very interesting time in American history. All right, so the war in Vietnam led to severe divisions among Americans, largely between the views of the younger generation and the older generation. The younger generation had heard the stories about the Great Depression and World War II in Korea, where the older generation had lived out those things and done them, and the younger generation didn't want to relive that and solve their problems differently. So, opponents of the war objected to its cost in lives and money. It was killing a lot of innocent people during this time, especially little children in Vietnam. The dictatorship in South Vietnam, it was corrupt, and people were upset about that because we were trying to support the South, but we didn't support the leader in charge. So that was kind of a crossroads. And then the devastation of the environment with the dropping of napalm and um, Agent Orange. It's not only destroying the environment, but also the people. Students opposed the draft, believing in that stopping the draft would halt the supply of soldiers needed to fight the war. These were called conscientious objectives, or objectors. Conscientious objectors. They were people claiming that their moral or religious beliefs prevented them from fighting. Others showed their feelings by burning their draft cards. It was just people did not want to go and fight because they didn't know what they were fighting for, where they were, why, all that stuff. Many Americans were dissatisfied with how President Johnson was handling the war, and the protests against the war were common. They were very common during this time. All right, so why do you think some supporters of the war were called traitors or draft dodgers? They may have felt that military service was a duty that should not be avoided and that refusing service was un-American, right? The older generation, known as like the greatest generation, they had fought in the wars. They knew how to do all this stuff. They thought it was the thing to do, the right thing, serve your country, be an American, patriot, all that stuff. So when people were dodging it, that's why they called them traitors or draft dodgers. All right, so you got Vietnam there. So here is South Vietnam, right here. North Vietnam is up here, right there. Okay, communist. This is the part we support. Here's China, right up at the top. Cambodia and Laos are independent. They used to be part of Indochina, right? French Indochina, this whole area. Then on the right there, on the far right, holding the microphone is President Johnson. On the left is Robert Kennedy. He is the younger brother of JFK, and we'll get to his story here in a little bit. All right, so young people are going to protest. The Viet Cong, remember the Viet Cong are communists who live in the South, attack Hue, and then they attack Saigon. Saigon is the current capital of South Vietnam. It's a pretty important port city. And they were attacking and just working their way down, trying to slowly defeat the South. January 31st, 1968 is known as Tet, or Vietnamese New Year, 1 year after New Year's, or 1 month after New Year's, sorry. This is the turning point. This is called the Tet Offensive. It caught the South off guard. The North was a lot stronger than the United States had anticipated, and this was a turning point for the North to defeat the South. A lot of people were starting to distrust Johnson. There was something known as a credibility gap. Basically, the people were not believing what he was saying anymore. They didn't trust him or the government. And this country is starting to divide over this war. People who support the war were called hawks. Now, hawks, this goes all the way back to the War of 1812 in United States history. The people who led the charge against the British were called war hawks. So they use the same terminology here. The War of 1812 was between the British and the United States, and nobody won. Nobody lost. It was a tie. Things remained the same, so it was kind of a pointless war. But anyway, the term hawks comes from the War of 1812. People who opposed the war were called owls. Okay, owls. Deferment is when you postpone going to war or don't go to war at all. This was usually for college students, richer, wealthier families, people with, if they had like surgeries or broken bone or something, they could defer at least for a little bit. If you had enough money, you could pay off the military, give them some money, and then you wouldn't have to go at all. That was your way of deferring. Other people went to Canada. That was their way of deferring, was leaving the country. So we talked about this in April 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. There were lots of riots after this. The leader of the civil rights movement was assassinated and killed, and people were rioting over this. Now, in 1968, at the primary election for the Democratic Party, there were anti-war protesters who confronted Chicago police. This really is going to help Nixon win his presidency during this time, because people are protesting what the Democrats are doing, because Johnson is a Democrat and they don't really like what's going on with Vietnam. Richard M. Nixon, M stands for Milhouse. He claimed to represent the silent majority, which is basically the people who were against the war or distrusted the government or all that stuff. He claimed to represent those people. So that helps him too in his campaign in the election of 1968. Now, why did some Americans feel the draft deferments were unfair? Well, I mentioned this. It's because it tended to favor middle-class Americans, such as college students, and discriminated against working-class families. So it kind of favored if you had money or if you were in college or something like that. Instead of you're just a blue-collar worker, you had to go. Like, they didn't really care. And people kind of felt that was a discrimination in a way. Alright, so you got the Tet Offensive over here. That red line is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Ho Chi Minh is the leader of the North. So basically they're starting. Hue is at the very top there. Hue is right there. And then Saigon is down over here. Right there. And they're just going up and down, destroying as much as they could. Now, with them going through Cambodia here, that's going to play an important role when Nixon becomes president. You can see one of his campaign buttons there. Nixon's the one. And then down over here is some of the rioting at the Democratic election. You can see there's men, women, African Americans, and Caucasians, white people. So we're uniting in fighting that, but we're going apart as a country in other ways. So It's an interesting time in America. Now, 1968, there's a lot that's going on. There's a series of attacks called the Tet Offensive. We talked about that, where the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were much stronger than had been reported. This took the South and the Allies, the Americans, by surprise, and they suffered a lot of heavy losses during this time. Johnson had a lot of opposition within his own party, and there was a growing anti-war movement, so he decides to not run for re-election. And instead, what they're going to do is Robert F. Kennedy is going to enter. He had served as the Attorney General and was a senator of New York at this time. And a lot of people he was probably going to be like the front runner for the Democratic Party. But we'll see what happens to him here. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated on April 4th, 1968, which led to riots across the United States. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated June 1968. Let's see here. Anyway, yeah, he was assassinated, and the Democrats were kind of shocked. So what they're going to do is they're going to try and rally, and eventually will pick a representative from Minnesota. Opposition to the war and unrest at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago helped Republican Richard Nixon win the 1968 presidential election. He won fairly well. In the Electoral College, he had 301 votes to 191. He won 43% of the popular vote, so he did pretty good. He had a pretty big win there. Usually what happens in United States history is when one party is in there and they're not doing so well, the Americans are going to go and vote for the opposite party the next election, and that's what happened here. Hubert H. Humphrey was the Democratic nomination in 1968, and he was from Minnesota. All right, so the major crisis events of 1968, just to review here. The Tet Offensive, okay, that was a crisis event because the North was a lot stronger than we had anticipated. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, that was a big deal. Violent riots and protests in American cities. Okay, people were protesting. You could also that's crisis events. Now the other major event was obviously the election in 1968. Now with Vietnam, remember this is the first televised conflict or war, and what happened was the guy who became pretty famous was Walter Cronkite. He hosted a lot of TV shows. He'd become a trusted face to the American public. He reported on the war in Vietnam. He had been a supporter, but when he saw what was happening, it kind of shook him up. He gave voice to the credibility gap when he said on air, "We have too often been disappointed by the optimism of the American leaders, both in Vietnam and Washington, to have faith any longer in the silver linings they find in the darkest clouds." So Cronkite, he was very trusted. He worked for CBS. He did the news, and he was very influential in reporting on what was going on in Vietnam. So hopefully this is okay. This video is going to be about 15 minutes long. Not too bad. If you guys got questions or whatever, don't be afraid to ask. You can email me or message me on Edmodo. It's up to you, whatever you guys think. If you got any comments, questions, concerns, whatever, just don't be afraid to hit me up.